Picture a guy named Marcus. He's 34, works in project management at a mid-sized company in Austin, Texas, makes $78,000 a year, and last March his boss called him into a conference room and told him he was getting a 6% raise. Marcus went home that night, told his wife. They opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving and felt genuinely good about where things were headed. 6 months later, Marcus sat down to look at why their bank account felt exactly the same as it did before the raise. The grocery bill was up. The car insurance renewal came in $40 higher than last year. The electric bill had crept up so quietly he hadn't even noticed until he looked at 12 months of statements side by side. His rent renewed at 8% more than the prior year. Marcus didn't feel richer. Marcus felt like he was running on a treadmill that had quietly sped up while he was looking the other way. My name is Jack, and what happened to Marcus is happening to tens of millions of Americans right now, and most of them have no idea why, which means they have no idea how to fix it. If you've ever gotten a raise and wondered why your life didn't actually feel any different, hit subscribe, because by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what inflation is doing to your paycheck, who is actually winning from it, and the specific moves that let you stop losing the game you didn't even know you were playing. Before we get into the math, let me tell you what inflation actually is, because the definition you learned in school is missing the part that matters most. The official story goes like this: inflation is the general rise in the price of goods and services over time, measured by something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The Bureau of Labor Statistics sends people out to track the prices of a theoretical basket of goods, everything from gasoline to haircuts to breakfast cereal, and when that basket costs more than it did last year, that percentage increase is what gets reported as the inflation rate. Sounds reasonable. Here's the problem. The basket is not your life. The CPI basket is a statistical average built on survey data about what a theoretical average American household spends money on. Your actual spending pattern, your city, your family size, your commute, your healthcare needs, your rent situation. None of that is in the basket. So when the government announces that inflation was 3.2% last year, what they're actually saying is that their specific basket of their specific items went up 3.2% on average across the entire country. Meanwhile, your rent went up 9%, your health insurance premium went up 11%, your car insurance jumped 18%, and your grocery bill for the same items you've bought 4 years is running about 22% higher than it was in 2021. The official number and your lived experience are two completely different things, and that gap is not an accident. Here's the part that should make you raise an eyebrow. The Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure, called PCE, and even the standard CPI both have a long history of methodological changes that have, almost without exception, made the reported inflation number smaller than it would have been under older methods. In 1983, the Bureau of Labor Statistics changed how it calculates housing costs. Instead of tracking what it actually costs to own a home, they switched to a concept called owner's equivalent rent, which asks homeowners to estimate what they think their home would rent for. That one change permanently lowered the reported inflation rate during every housing boom that followed. There's also substitution bias built directly into the model. When beef gets expensive, the model assumes you switch to chicken, so it counts the chicken price instead, which means the CPI is partially measuring the inflation rate of a person who keeps quietly downgrading their life, not the inflation rate of someone who just wants to keep living the same way they were living before. And then there's what the CPI famously excluded for years: food and energy, the two categories that most directly hit working Americans every single month, excluded because they're, quote, too volatile. So the most important number in your financial life is being measured with a tool that was specifically redesigned over several decades to read lower than the reality most households actually experience. Now let me introduce you to someone alongside Marcus. Her name is Diana. Same age, same city, also got a raise. Last year, also 6%. Marcus and Diana work at competing firms doing essentially the same job. From the outside, their financial lives look almost identical. But what they did with that information, specifically what they understood about what that raise actually meant, is where everything diverges. Marcus heard 6% raise and thought, I make more money now. Diana heard 6% raise, looked at the actual inflation data for Austin, Texas for the previous 12 months, and thought, my real expenses went up between 7 and 9%. This year, depending on the category, which means this raise is approximately a 1 to 3% pay cut in purchasing power. Same number, two completely different realities. Diana was not smarter than Marcus. She just understood one concept that most people are never taught, which is the difference between a nominal raise and a real raise. A nominal raise is the number your boss gives you. A real raise is what happens after inflation takes its share. And right now, for most American workers, inflation has been taking a bigger share than the raise covers for long enough that the cumulative damage is starting to show up in ways people can feel but can't explain, which is exactly why Marcus's bank account looked the same 6 months after his raise as it did before it. Here is the simplest and most important way to think about everything we've covered so far. Your salary is a number. Your purchasing power is what that number actually buys. Inflation is the rate at which the gap between those two things widens. And if your salary grows slower than inflation, you are getting poorer in real terms every single year, even if the number on your paycheck keeps going up. That is not a theory. That is arithmetic. And for the majority of American workers since 2020, real wages have been negative more often than they have been positive. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's wage growth tracker, which is one of the more honest measures of what real workers are actually earning, showed that median wage growth consistently ran below CPI for most of 2021, 2022, and 2023. Then it flipped briefly positive. Then it flattened again. The window where workers were actually gaining ground in real terms was narrow, and most people didn't use it to reposition because they didn't know it existed. Now here's the part that nobody teaches you in a personal finance class, and it is the most important thing in this entire video. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. It is not a neutral tax on the economy. It is a systematic transfer of purchasing power from one group of people to another, and the direction of that transfer is almost always the same. It moves from people who hold cash to people who hold assets. It moves from renters to landlords. It moves from savers to borrowers. It moves from wage earners to business owners with pricing power. Here's why. When inflation runs at 5%, you're $50,000 sitting in a savings account earning 4%, just lost 1% of its real value. You did everything right, you saved money, you put it somewhere that earns interest, and you still fell behind. Meanwhile, the person who borrowed $400,000 to buy a rental property is paying back that loan with dollars that are worth less every year, while the rent on the property keeps climbing with inflation. The borrower wins. The saver loses. The landlord wins. The renter loses. This is not accidental. This is a structural feature of how inflation interacts with leverage and asset ownership. And it is precisely why the wealth gap in the United States has widened every single time inflation has run hot in the last 50 years, because inflation functions as a hidden tax on the asset poor and a hidden subsidy for the asset rich. Let me make this concrete with a number that should genuinely bother you. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, cumulative inflation from January 2020 to January 2026 has run approximately 23%. That means Something that cost $100 in January 2020 costs roughly $123 today. Now look at what wages did over that same period. The Employment Cost Index shows total compensation for private sector workers grew about 24% over the same window. So on paper, workers basically kept up, right? Here's where it breaks down. That 24% wage growth is an average across all workers, including the top earners who got the largest raises and the largest bonuses. When you look specifically at non-supervisory production workers, the people stocking shelves, driving trucks, working assembly lines, real wage growth was negative for most of that period. And even for the workers in the middle, who technically kept pace with headline CPI, they were measured against a basket that was specifically designed to undercount the inflation in housing, healthcare, and childcare, which happened to be the three largest budget items for most working families in America. So the average worker technically broke even against the official number while losing ground against their actual life. Now let's run the compounding math on a real household, because this is where it stops being abstract. Meet a couple in Phoenix. Combined income $110,000, 2 kids. They have $45,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account, earning 4.2%, which feels smart because it's way better than a regular checking account. In a 3% inflation environment, that 4.2% return is actually generating about 1.2% in real purchasing power growth. Not bad, but here's where they are actually living. Their specific basket of expenses, rent, groceries, utilities, healthcare, childcare, car insurance has been running at about 6 to 7% inflation annually since 2021. Against that number, their 4.2% savings rate is losing ground by 2 to 3% per year in real terms. That $45,000 in 10 years at 4.2% nominal growth becomes about $67,800 in nominal dollars. But if their cost of living compounded at just 5% per year over that same decade, the purchasing power equivalent of their $45,000 today would need to be $73,300 in 10 years just to buy the same things. They end up $5,500 short in real terms, even though the number in their account went up by over $22,000. They will look at that savings account in 10 years and feel like they did something right, and in nominal terms, they did, but inflation will have quietly picked their pocket while they were patting themselves on the back. This is why parking your entire financial life in a high-yield savings account is not a wealth-building strategy. It is a slow-motion losing strategy dressed up in a respectable interest rate. So what actually works? Let me be specific, because generic advice about just investing in stocks is not useful to someone who is genuinely trying to understand this. The assets that consistently beat inflation over long periods are ones that have either pricing power or real productive value attached to them. Broad equity index funds work because the companies inside them can raise their prices when their input costs go up, which means their revenues and eventually their stock prices rise with inflation over time. The S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% nominally per year over long periods, which at even a 3% inflation rate leaves a real return of about 7%. That is how you actually build wealth instead of just maintaining it. Real estate with leverage works for the same reason. Diana understood her raise. You borrow fixed dollars. Inflation makes those dollars cheaper over time, and the asset itself appreciates and generates income that rises with prices. Treasury inflation protected securities known as TIPS and I-bonds are the right tools for the safe portion of your portfolio because they are explicitly indexed to CPI, which means they at least keep pace with the official number even if they do not fully cover your personal inflation rate. I-bonds are capped at $10,000 per person per year, which for a couple is $20,000 annually, and at times of high inflation they have paid over 9%, which is genuinely exceptional for a government-backed product. Skills that command raises above inflation are also a real asset, and this is the one people consistently undervalue. If you can negotiate a raise of 8 to 10%. In a 4% inflation environment, you have done more for your real purchasing power in one conversation than most people accomplish in 5 years of savings. Optimization, the single biggest mistake most people make when they understand inflation for the first time, is assuming that moving their cash from a checking account to a high-yield savings account is the solution. It is a better version of the same losing strategy. It reduces your losses against inflation, but it does not reverse them. The only way to reverse them is to own things that grow faster than prices, and the only way to own those things is to stop holding more cash than your emergency fund actually requires. Here's what bothered Diana about her 6% raise that Marcus never thought to ask. She did not just look at the number. She asked what the number meant against her actual expenses in her actual city for her actual life. And when she ran that math and realized she was behind, she did not panic, and she did not just put the extra income in savings and feel virtuous about it. She spent one Saturday afternoon redirecting the difference, the gap between what her raise added and what inflation was taking, into a low-cost index fund on an automatic monthly transfer, so she would never see it and never be tempted to spend it. She also renegotiated her lease renewal using real local rent data from Zillow and Apartments.com to push back on her landlord's proposed 11% increase and got it down to 5%, which was worth more than most people earn in a month of side hustle income. And she started tracking her personal inflation rate, not the CPI number, but the actual year-over-year change in what her specific household spends money on, because once you know your real number, you stop being fooled by the official one. Let's come back to Marcus and Diana 15 years from now. It is 2041. They are both 49. They still live in Austin. They are both earning more than they were, and they have both received dozens of raises over the past 15 years. Marcus got raises that averaged about 5% per year. Inflation over that period averaged about 4%. On paper, Marcus was almost keeping. But Marcus kept his savings in cash equivalent accounts his whole career because he was nervous about the market and figured a good interest rate was good enough. In real purchasing power terms, Marcus is roughly where he was 15 years ago, maybe marginally ahead. He is 49, he has $87,000 saved, and he is starting to do the retirement math and realizing it is not going to work the way he thought it was. Diana took the exact same raises, averaged the exact same 5% annual salary growth, and lived in the same city facing the exact same inflation. But Diana invested the gap every single time. She bought index funds during the down years because she understood that inflation was hitting her harder in cash than in equities, and she never stopped the automatic transfer no matter what the market was doing. Diana is 49 with $340,000 invested and a clear path to retiring in her early 60s without depending on Social Security to cover her actual needs. Same raises, same inflation, same city. One understood what the raise actually meant. One celebrated the number and never looked any deeper. That is the entire game compressed into 2 people and 15 years. The raise is not the win. The raise is the starting point of a question you are required to ask yourself every single time, which is, did this raise actually move me forward in real terms, or did it just keep me on the same treadmill at the same speed while the belt quietly got faster underneath me? Once you start asking that question, you stop being fooled by nominal numbers and you start making decisions based on real ones, and that shift alone puts you in a completely different category from the majority of people who will spend their entire careers feeling like they are making progress while inflation quietly drains the tank. Marcus is not a bad saver. Marcus is just a person who was never given the framework to understand what his raise actually meant. Now you have it. Use it. If this video helped you finally understand what has been happening to your paycheck, hit subscribe because this is exactly the kind of thing we break down every week, the real math behind the financial system that most people are navigating completely blind. I will see you in the next one.